The sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz filled the grand hall of one of the city's most luxurious hotels. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly baked bread. Guests in elegant suits and shimmering dresses laughed lightly over candle-lit tables, unaware of the tired young woman quietly moving between them with a tray in her hands. She was just one of the many waitresses working that night, but her presence was softer, almost invisible. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, her uniform perfectly ironed, and her eyes focused only on her work. She had been working at the hotel for months, always taking the late shifts because those paid a little extra. Each night she told herself she would only think about work, not about the piano she once dreamed of, playing or the life she had lost. Along the way, every table she passed seemed to remind her of what she used to be, full of dreams and melodies. Once, long ago, her world revolved around music. Her father had taught her how to play the piano when she was a child. Their small apartment didn't have much, but there was an old upright piano against the wall. The wood was scratched, some keys were yellowed, but it was her favorite thing in the world. She used to wake up early just to play before school, while her father sat nearby with a cup of tea, smiling quietly as he listened. Those memories felt like another lifetime now. Her father had passed away years ago after a long illness. Then her mother's health began to fail, and life quickly turned from soft melodies to unpaid bills and extra shifts. The piano lesson stopped. The piano itself had to be sold. Now she worked from morning till night, always tired but never complaining. She knew she couldn't afford to dream. Dreams didn't pay hospital bills. That night, the hotel was hosting a charity dinner for one of the country's most well-known billionaires. He was the kind of man everyone respected publicly, but whispered about privately. His company built towers and ran banks, and his name carried power. But behind his wealth was a reputation, proud, controlling, and used to being admired. He sat at the center table, surrounded by other businessmen and wealthy guests. Even from a distance, his voice was firm, his laugh loud, his posture straight. Every waiter and waitress had been told to be on their best behavior. No mistakes, no delays. The young waitress moved carefully, balancing a tray of drinks as she approached his table. Her steps were quiet, her expression calm, though her heart always raced when she had to serve near him. He had a sharp eye, and if something went wrong, people lost their jobs. The pianist in the corner played soft background music, elegant, skillful, but mechanical. Each song sounded practiced, emotionless. The guests didn't notice. They only cared about the performance as part of the atmosphere. When the waitress placed another glass on the billionaire's table, she accidentally hummed a few notes under her breath. It was a habit she had when she worked, something that helped her keep calm. The sound was so soft that she didn't even realize she was doing it. But someone did. The billionaire's head turned sharply toward her. "Did you just hum?" he asked, his voice deep and serious. The music stopped for a moment as the pianist glanced over, sensing tension. The waitress froze, tray still in her hands. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, cutting her off. "So you think you can sing too? Or maybe you think you could do better than my pianist here?" His words were coated with sarcasm, but his tone demanded attention. A few guests chuckled softly. They knew the man's habit of teasing the staff for his amusement. The waitress's cheeks flushed. "No, sir. I was just—" He leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained by her nervousness. "No need to apologize. Let's see what kind of talent you're hiding." His eyes shifted toward the grand piano at the corner of the hall. "Go ahead. Play something for us." The entire room went quiet. The waitress looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, I can't. I'm just a server." "Then serve us some music," he replied coldly, a hint of a smile forming on his face. "If you refuse, you can leave for the night. I don't keep anyone who can't follow simple instructions." Her throat went dry. The guests exchanged looks, some uncomfortable, others amused. They didn't expect her to take the challenge seriously. The head waiter, standing near the wall, shot her a warning glance. He couldn't speak, but his eyes said everything. "Do it or you'll lose your job." The waitress's heart pounded in her chest. She needed this job. Her mother's medicine, the rent, everything depended on it. For a long moment she stood there, frozen. Then slowly she placed the tray on a side table, wiped her trembling hands on her apron, and began to walk toward the piano. The room watched her in silence. Her steps echoed faintly on the marble floor. The pianist quietly stood up, uncertain whether to stay or leave. The billionaire gestured for him to step aside. "Let's see what the girl can do," he said with a smirk. When she reached the piano, she paused. It was a magnificent instrument, sleek, polished, grand. She could see her reflection on its glossy surface. Her fingers hovered over the keys but didn't press them yet. Her chest tightened with nerves. It had been so long since she had touched a piano. The last time was in a small room filled with warmth and laughter, her father's smile beside her. Now the weight of hundreds of eyes pressed on her back. She could feel the judgment in the air. To them, she was just a waitress, someone meant to pour drinks, not play art. The billionaire's voice broke the silence again. "Any day now," she took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking. She pressed one key, a soft note echoed through the hall. It wasn't confident. It wasn't graceful. A few guests snickered quietly. Her heart sank. For a moment she wanted to run. But then she remembered her father's words. Music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. She closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, just one note at a time. She placed both hands on the keys again and began to play a simple melody, the same one her father had taught her when she was little. It was rough at first, uneven, like a forgotten language returning slowly. But as the familiar rhythm returned, something in her shifted. The sound of laughter faded in her mind. The smell of the restaurant disappeared. All she could hear was the piano. Her fingers began to move more freely, gently, sincerely. Each note carried a piece of her story, her father's lessons, the nights of worry, the dreams buried under work. The billionaire watched with raised eyebrows, still expecting her to embarrass herself. But something about the way her shoulders relaxed and her face softened made him pause. The guests didn't know what to think. Some still smiled mockingly, but others leaned forward slightly, sensing that something about her playing was different. The song wasn't perfect. She missed a few keys, but the emotion behind it was raw and real. The melody grew stronger, filling the vast hall with a warmth that even the expensive chandeliers couldn't match. She forgot about the crowd, the billionaire, the uniform. For those few minutes, she was just herself, the girl who once believed music could heal the world. When the song ended, she opened her eyes. The room was silent. She couldn't read their expressions. Her heart pounded, unsure whether she had done something brave or foolish. The billionaire stared at her, expression unreadable. Then slowly he clapped once, a soft, deliberate sound. A few guests followed, though some looked unsure whether to join in or stay quiet. "You have spirit," he said finally. "Maybe too much for a waitress." His words were half compliment, half challenge. But that wasn't bad. The waitress lowered her eyes, murmuring a polite "Thank you, sir." The billionaire waved his hand. "Back to work," she nodded, stepping away from the piano, her heart still racing. The pianist returned to his seat, looking at her with a strange mix of respect and disbelief. As she picked up her tray again, she felt something stir inside her, a forgotten spark. For the first time in years, she had played again. Even if it was out of fear, even if she had been forced, it reminded her of who she once was. When she glanced back at the piano, she saw the billionaire still watching her quietly. His expression had changed. Not amusement anymore, but curiosity. That night, as the dinner continued, she worked in silence, but something about her steps felt lighter. She didn't know it yet, but that single song would change everything. Not only for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The man who forced her to play didn't realize it then, but he had just opened a door to a story that would silence his entire world one day, with just one song. The night after the charity dinner, the young waitress could not sleep. The sound of the piano still echoed in her head, not as music, but as memory. She had played in front of hundreds of people, including one of the richest and most powerful men in the country. She had done it without thinking, without planning. It had felt like a dream, or maybe something beyond that, but reality soon returned. She was just a waitress. The applause, the curious glances, the moments she had spent at that piano, they all faded as quickly as they came. Tomorrow she would wear her same uniform, serve the same tables, and live the same life. Still, something inside her had changed. There was a small light burning now, something she hadn't felt in years. A quiet reminder that her dreams were still somewhere inside her. The next evening, She arrived at work as usual. The hotel lobby was buzzing again. Wealthy guests came and went, and the soft music from the piano filled the air. Everything looked the same, but she noticed how a few coworkers looked at her differently now. Some smiled softly, some whispered behind her back. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or curiosity. The head waiter approached her with a calm but serious face. "The manager wants to see you," he said quietly. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she thought she might be in trouble for what happened the previous night. Maybe the billionaire had complained. Maybe she had embarrassed the hotel. She wiped her hands nervously and followed the head waiter to the manager's office. The manager sat behind a large desk. Glasses perched on his nose, flipping through papers. When he saw her, he gestured for her to sit. "You played the piano last night?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "The guest asked me to." He leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "You caused quite a scene," he said. "The billionaire called this morning. He was interested." She blinked in surprise. "Interested?" The manager nodded. "He wants you to play again. He's hosting a private dinner tomorrow night in the same hall. He said you'll perform one piece during the evening." The waitress was speechless. She had never been asked to play music since leaving her old life behind. "Sir, I'm not a pianist. He interrupted her gently. "You don't have a choice, dear." The request came from him personally. "You'll do as he says. Consider it part of your job." Her chest tightened. Part of her wanted to refuse. She wasn't ready for something like this. But she needed the job, and saying no wasn't an option. That night she walked home slowly through the quiet streets. The city lights reflected in the puddles on the ground, and her footsteps echoed softly. Every sound felt like a reminder of what she had agreed to do. When she reached home, her mother was sitting by the window, knitting an old scarf. The small apartment smelled faintly of soup. Her mother smiled weakly when she entered. "You're late again," she said softly. "Yes," the girl replied. "There was an event." Her mother studied her face for a moment. "You look different tonight," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Something happened?" The girl hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I played the piano at work." Her mother's eyes widened in surprise. "You played? After all these years?" She nodded. "It wasn't planned. One of the guests asked me to. I was scared, but I did it." Her mother's eyes softened. "Your father would have been proud," she whispered. "He always said your hands were born for music." The words touched her deeply. For a moment, she wanted to cry. Instead, she just sat down and listened to the rain begin to fall outside. That night, she couldn't sleep again. She lay awake thinking about what she would play at the private dinner. She didn't have a piano at home, only a small keyboard that sometimes failed to work. But she took it out from under her bed and cleaned off the dust. She began pressing a few keys, softly at first, just to remember how it felt. The sound was thin and weak, but it was enough. Her fingers moved awkwardly at first, but soon the rhythm returned. As she played quietly into the night, she remembered how her father used to say, "Every key is a word, and every song is a story." She smiled faintly. Maybe tomorrow she could tell her story again. The next evening, the hotel looked even grander than before. The chandelier lights shimmered brighter. The tables were decorated with flowers, and a sense of importance hung in the air. Only a few select guests were invited this time. The billionaire sat at the same table, dressed in a dark suit, surrounded by people who hung on his every word. When the waitress entered the hall, the other staff greeted her with quiet curiosity. They had all heard what was going to happen. The head waiter handed her a small note, instructions from the billionaire. It said simply, "You will play after the second course." Her hands trembled as she held the paper. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. During the dinner, she served dishes and poured wine as usual, though her heart wasn't in it. Every tick of the clock brought her closer to the moment she had been dreading. When the second course ended, she quietly walked toward the piano. The same pianist from the previous night was there again, waiting by the instrument. He nodded politely and stepped aside. The billionaire's eyes followed her as she sat down. "Let's see if last night was luck," he said coldly, loud enough for a few people to hear. Her fingers hovered above the keys. The hall was silent. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she began to play, This time the song was different, gentler, slower, full of sadness and warmth. It was a melody her father had written long ago, something no one else had ever heard. The first few notes were quiet, uncertain. But then the music began to bloom, filling the air with emotion. The guests stopped talking. Even the servers paused mid-step. Her playing wasn't about showing skill or impressing anyone. It was about memory, love, and pain. As she played, her face softened, her hands moved with ease, and her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. The song carried something invisible, a feeling too honest to fake. By the time she reached the final note, there wasn't a sound in the hall. It was as if the whole world had stopped breathing. The last key faded into silence, and for a few seconds no one moved. Then, one by one, the guests began to clap. Softly at first, then louder. The billionaire didn't clap. He just sat there staring at her with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes, surprise, maybe even respect, but also confusion. He wasn't used to being moved by anyone, least of all a waitress. When the applause ended, she stood up, bowed slightly, and returned to her duties without saying a word. As the evening went on, the billionaire seemed quieter. He watched her as she worked, but not in the same way as before. His arrogance had softened slightly, replaced by curiosity. When the dinner finally ended and the guests began to leave, he approached her near the piano. She turned, startled to see him standing so close. "You played beautifully," he said, his voice lower than usual. "What was that piece?" She hesitated, unsure if she should speak casually to a man like him. "It was something my father taught me," she said softly. He nodded slowly, looking down at the piano keys. "There's something honest about the way you play," he said. "I've heard the best musicians in the world, but none of them made me feel what you just did." She didn't know what to say. She simply nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her for another moment as if trying to read her thoughts, then turned and walked away without another word. When she finally left the hotel that night, the city felt different. The cold wind brushed her face, but she didn't mind. She felt alive again, not because of the applause, but because she had found a small piece of herself that she thought was gone forever. As she walked home through the quiet streets, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this is just the beginning." She didn't know what would come next, but deep down she felt that her life was slowly changing, one unexpected song at a time. The days after the private dinner passed slowly for the young waitress. Work continued as usual. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of guests, and the soft music from the pianist in the corner. Everything seemed ordinary, but for her nothing felt ordinary anymore. The memory of her playing, of all those eyes on her, and the brief moment when even the billionaire seemed impressed, stayed alive in her mind. Each time she walked past the grand piano, her fingers itched to touch the keys. She remembered the way the music had flowed through her hands and filled the air, how it had carried her past fear, and how it had touched people without any words. It had been years since she had felt anything like that. One afternoon, as she was serving drinks in the hotel lobby, one of the managers approached her. "The billionaire has requested your presence again," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He wants you to play for another event tomorrow evening." Her stomach twisted. She hadn't expected this to happen so soon. "Another performance?" she asked softly. "Yes," he replied. "He said you made quite an impression last time. He seems curious about your music." She nodded slowly. There was no way to refuse. Every time she thought about playing in front of him again, her chest tightened with nervousness. She loved music, yes, but performing under pressure, especially for someone so powerful, terrified her. That evening, she returned home and found her mother resting on the small couch. Her mother looked up as she entered and gave her a soft smile. "Long day?" she asked. "Yes," she replied, sitting beside her. "And tomorrow will be harder." Her mother reached out and held her hand. "You are stronger than you think," she said quietly. "Your father always believed in your music, and I do too." Her mother's words comforted her more than she expected. Somehow they made her feel less alone. She spent the night practicing quietly on the small keyboard she kept tucked under her bed. The notes weren't loud or perfect, but they reminded her of what she could do, and that feeling was enough to calm her anxious mind. The next day arrived faster than she hoped. She dressed carefully in her uniform, but this time her hands shook slightly less. She had a plan. not a detailed one, but she would focus on the music and not the audience. That thought alone gave her courage. When she arrived at the hotel, the hall was already decorated for the evening event. Guests began arriving, their conversations light but full of excitement. The air was filled with the smell of flowers and fine wine. She could feel the tension in the room, the anticipation of the wealthy crowd. The billionaire was there, seated at the center table just as before. He noticed her as she walked past, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no smirk this time, only a look of curiosity, as if he wanted to see who she really was. When it was time for her performance, the pianist moved aside again. The room fell silent, waiting. The young waitress approached the piano, her heart racing but her mind focused. She took a deep breath and sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment she hesitated. The memory of last night's applause and the way people had looked at her made her nervous. But then she remembered her father's words. Music doesn't need an audience. It only needs honesty. She pressed the first key and the soft, familiar note filled the room. She closed her eyes and let her fingers find the melody on their own. It was a song she had composed long ago when she was just a child, inspired by the love of her family and the comfort of home. As she played, the room seemed to change. Conversations died down. Guests leaned forward, drawn to the music without realizing it. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, flowing over the keys as the melody rose and fell with gentle grace. The billionaire's expression changed slowly. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, softened. He leaned back in his chair, listening intently. Something about her music seemed to bypass his usual pride, touching a part of him he rarely allowed to be reached. For her, it wasn't about impressing him or anyone else. She had learned something important. When she played for herself, the music was free. And when she played from the heart, everyone else could feel it too. The song built gradually, not in grand, flashy gestures, but in quiet strength. It told a story of longing, of hope, of resilience, all without words. Some guests felt tears rise in their eyes, though they tried to hide it. Even the staff standing at the back were captivated, holding trays but unable to look away. She had entered the piano with hesitation, but now, as the notes flowed naturally, she felt a sense of liberation. Each key she pressed carried a piece of her soul, and for the first time in years she felt seen. Not for her uniform or her job, but for who she truly was. As the song reached its end, the last note lingered in the air, soft and pure. For a few seconds there was no sound at all. The room held its breath, suspended in the quiet aftermath of something beautiful. Finally, applause broke out, slow at first, then growing louder. Some guests wiped tears from their eyes, others clapped with wide smiles. But the billionaire didn't move immediately. He just sat there staring at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "That was unexpected," he said. "You play differently than anyone I've ever met. Not for show, not for recognition, but because it matters to you." She nodded politely, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to praise from someone like him. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. He leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "You have a rare gift," he said finally. "I don't usually say that about anyone. Most people play to be seen. You play to be heard." The words struck her more than she expected. She had spent so long hiding her talent, feeling ashamed of it, feeling that it was a dream too distant to reach. But hearing him say that made her feel validated in a way she hadn't experienced before. The dinner continued, but her mind remained on the piano. She had played not to impress, not to obey, but to connect with her own past, with her father's memory, and now, unexpectedly, with everyone in the room. When the guests left, she quietly returned to her duties, serving coffee and clearing plates. She moved with the same calm precision as always, but now there was a quiet strength in her steps, a confidence that had not been there before. Later, as she packed her things to leave, the head waiter approached. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said quietly. "The billionaire asked a lot of questions about you. He's intrigued." She smiled faintly, feeling both nervous and proud. "I just played," she said. "That's all I did." He nodded, understanding. "Sometimes playing is enough. That's all anyone can ask for." When she walked home, the streets seemed quieter than usual. The city lights reflected on wet pavement and the cool air brushed her face. She thought about what had happened, about how fear had turned into something beautiful, and about how music, something she had thought lost forever, had returned to her life in the most unexpected way. She entered her small apartment and found her mother asleep on the couch, the scarf still in her hands. She sat down beside her for a moment, quietly grateful for this small, steady life she had. And yet deep down she felt a spark, a feeling that something bigger was waiting for her, just beyond the next piano key she pressed. She pulled out her notebook, the one where she had written little melodies and pieces of songs over the years. She flipped through it slowly, remembering the dreams she had once carried. Maybe one day those melodies would not just be memories. Maybe they would become her future. That night she practiced again, letting her fingers dance over the keys in private. The music filled the small apartment, soft but alive. It reminded her that talent could survive even when life seemed determined to bury it. That talent was still there, and now, for the first time in years, she believed it could grow. She didn't know what would come next. The billionaire might ask her to play again. The hotel might have other events. People might still see her as just a waitress. But now she carried a secret, a quiet power that lived in her hands and her heart. And that power, that gift, had the ability to change everything, starting with her own life. The days passed quickly, and soon another special event was scheduled at the hotel. This time it wasn't a casual dinner or a charity night. It was a private gathering for a small group of influential people, and the billionaire himself had insisted that she play. The young waitress could feel her heart tighten as she prepared for the evening. The pressure was heavier this time. It wasn't just about her performance anymore. She could feel that everyone, including the billionaire, was waiting to see what she would do. That afternoon she arrived at work earlier than usual. The hotel staff were bustling around, setting tables, polishing silverware, and arranging flowers. Everything needed to be perfect, and the air was filled with anticipation. Even the pianist in the corner seemed tense, as if he too knew this night was different. She went to the piano to check it, running her fingers lightly over the polished keys. They felt smooth and cool, and she remembered the first time she had ever touched this instrument. Her father had placed her small hands on the keys, telling her that music wasn't about speed or strength. It was about honesty. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting that memory settle in her mind. The evening began, and the guests started arriving. They were dressed in their finest clothes, their conversations filled with polite laughter and soft compliments. The atmosphere was more formal than any event she had ever been part of. She moved between tables, serving drinks and making small talk, all while her mind rehearsed the piece she intended to play. When the time came, the head waiter approached her quietly. "It's your moment," he said softly. She nodded, her throat tight. She took a deep breath and walked toward the grand piano, each step echoing slightly on the marble floor. The guests stopped their conversations as they noticed her approaching. Some looked curious, some skeptical, and some simply amused. The billionaire was seated at his usual table, his expression unreadable. His eyes followed her every move. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart race. She sat down at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a long moment she didn't play. She could hear the soft rustle of dresses, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet shuffle of people adjusting in their chairs. She felt the weight of all those eyes upon her, waiting, judging, expecting. She swallowed hard and tried to calm her nerves. Then, slowly, she pressed the first key. A soft note filled the room, pure and gentle. She closed her eyes and let her hands move naturally, guided by memory and emotion rather than thought. The piece she had chosen wasn't long or flashy, but it was filled with depth. Every note carried a story, a feeling she had buried for years. As she played, the room began to change. Conversations faded. People stopped shifting in their seats. Even the servers paused, holding trays as they watched, mesmerized. The music flowed like a river, gentle at first, then stronger, more confident, more alive. Her hands moved with precision and grace, each key a word, each chord a sentence in a story only she could tell. The melody rose and fell, carrying the weight of loss, hope, and resilience. It was not a song to impress, but a song to touch hearts. The billionaire's expression softened as he listened. His usual sternness melted into something rare, admiration, perhaps even wonder. He leaned back in his chair, listening carefully, unable to look away. For the first time, someone had moved him without speaking, without ambition, without intention to prove something. The guests were equally captivated. Some had tears in their eyes, others simply sat in silence, caught in the magic of the moment. They weren't watching a waitress anymore. They were listening to a musician, someone whose talent could not be ignored. She felt herself becoming lost in the music. The fear that had gripped her at the beginning was gone, replaced by focus and courage. Every note she played was a piece of her soul, a message she had longed to share but never thought anyone would hear. As the piece reached its climax, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The melody swelled, powerful yet delicate, commanding attention without demanding it. Every listener was drawn in, their hearts caught in the tension and release of the music. Even the billionaire, who rarely let himself be moved, seemed frozen in place. The final notes hung in the air, fading slowly, almost painfully. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. The only sound was the soft echo of the piano's last resonance. No one moved, no one breathed audibly. The silence was heavy, full of awe and disbelief. Then a single clap broke the quiet, soft but deliberate. It was the billionaire. He leaned forward slightly, looking at her with wide eyes. The guests, unsure how to respond, paused for a moment. Then one by one, they began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Some were crying quietly, others smiling through tears. The applause was not polite or forced. It was real, from the heart. She stayed seated for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Her hands rested gently on the keys, still trembling slightly. She opened her eyes and looked at the room. The faces that had been skeptical or dismissive were now filled with amazement and respect. She felt a strange mix of relief and pride, though she tried to hide it under her usual polite smile. The billionaire rose from his seat, walking toward her slowly. The room quieted immediately. He stopped in front of the piano and looked at her directly. I didn't expect that," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one has ever played like that for me. Not with honesty, not with soul. You have a gift that is rare, and it's wasted in a kitchen." She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. I just play," she said softly. He shook his head slightly. "No, you do much more than that. You make people feel. You make me feel something I didn't know I could feel again." His eyes held a mixture of wonder and something else. Respect, maybe even humility. She stood up, still holding her hands together, and nodded politely. She didn't want to speak too much, didn't want to seem arrogant or demanding. She had never sought attention for her music. She only wanted to play to express herself, and now she realized that sometimes expression was more powerful than words. The billionaire looked around the room, then back at her. "I want to hear you play more," he said. "Not tomorrow, not for anyone else. Just play when you want. Don't let anyone stop you from playing." For a moment, she felt stunned. He was offering her freedom in a way she had never expected. Freedom to play not because someone forced her, not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she could. As the guests began to leave, murmuring compliments and lingering in awe, she returned to her duties. But this time she moved with a quiet confidence. Something inside her had shifted. She had discovered the power of her own music, not for fame or recognition, but for herself and for the people who could feel it. Later that night, as she walked home, she thought about what had happened. The piano, the audience, the billionaire, they were all part of her story now. She realized that music could open doors she had thought were closed forever. It could connect people across walls of wealth, status, and expectation. And it could give her a voice even when she had been silent for so long. Her mother was waiting when she returned. "How was tonight?" she asked softly. The young woman smiled faintly. "Different," she said, "but good. I played and people listened." Her mother's eyes sparkled. "I always knew you had something special. Your father knew too. I'm glad you're remembering who you are." For the first time in years, the young woman felt a sense of possibility. The fear that had held her back was fading. She could see a future where her music mattered, where she didn't have to hide her talent, and where her dreams could be more than just memories. As she lay in bed that night, she thought about the piano, the notes, and the story she had told without words. She realized that she had done something extraordinary, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because she let herself be true. And in that truth, she had discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. The events of that evening would stay with her forever. The billionaire had seen her, really seen her in a way no one else had. And the guests had felt something real, something that went beyond music. They had witnessed a quiet miracle. A waitress transforming a room with a song, a melody so honest and full of feeling that it left everyone in awe. She didn't know what the future held. Perhaps the billionaire would ask her to play again. Perhaps other opportunities would arise. But she did know one thing. The power of music, the strength in her hands, and the courage to be herself would never leave her again. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. And that freedom, born from a single song, would guide her through everything that was yet to come. The day of the grand event arrived, and the hotel was buzzing with activity more than ever before. This was not just another dinner or private gathering. The billionaire had invited a small group of international guests, people who held influence over businesses, media, and culture. The young waitress could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She was no longer just a server. She was expected to perform, to leave an impression that would be remembered. All morning she rehearsed quietly in a small empty room near the staff area. Her fingers glided over the keys of the practice piano, and she felt the familiar warmth in her hands. The nervousness was still there, but it had transformed into a steady energy. She knew tonight would test her, and yet somehow she felt ready. When she arrived at the main hall, the atmosphere was electric. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling light across the polished marble floors. Tables were arranged meticulously, adorned with candles and fresh flowers. Every detail seemed designed to impress, but she wasn't thinking about grandeur. She was thinking about the music she carried in her heart. The guests began to arrive, whispering to each other, noticing the grandeur of the event. Some were curious about the young waitress who had been asked to play. Some doubted that a server could produce anything remarkable. Others had heard whispers of her previous performances and wondered if the stories were true. The billionaire arrived last, as usual. He wore his signature dark suit and carried the air of authority effortlessly. But tonight his eyes were different, sharper, more focused, as if he were preparing for something he had not expected before. When he saw her, his expression softened slightly, though he did not speak. The dinner began, and the young waitress moved among the tables, serving wine and food with her usual calm precision. But now every step she took carried a quiet confidence. She knew the moment would come when all eyes would turn to her, and she was determined to be ready. Finally, the time arrived. The pianist in the corner gave her a small nod, then stepped aside. The room fell silent instantly as she approached the grand piano. Her heart raced, but her mind was focused. She remembered her father's words, "Play with honesty and everyone will listen." She sat down, feeling the cool touch of the polished keys beneath her fingers. For a moment she hesitated, glancing around the room. Hundreds of eyes were on her, but instead of fear, she felt a quiet determination. She pressed the first key and a soft note filled the air. Then she closed her eyes, letting the melody flow naturally. This was a song she had composed herself, a piece she had never played for anyone. It was a reflection of her life. Moments of struggle, hope, love, and loss intertwined in the harmony of the keys. At first the notes were delicate, like a whisper. The guests listened, unsure at first, then leaning forward, captivated by the authenticity of the music. Her fingers moved with precision, each key pressed with intention, each chord resonating with emotion. The music grew gradually, weaving through the room like a gentle wind turning into a storm of feeling. The young waitress was no longer thinking about the audience. She was no longer the waitress serving wine or clearing plates. She was the music itself. The billionaire seated at the center table was completely silent. He was used to controlling every situation, used to seeing talent displayed on command. But tonight he was powerless to stop the impact of her music. Something about her playing was different. It was real, it was raw, it was unforgettable. Guests who had doubted her talent moments before now found themselves holding their breath. The music spoke to them, bypassing intellect, ego, and expectation. It reached into their hearts directly, carrying with it a story of resilience and quiet courage. Her hands moved faster now, but with grace. The melody rose and fell, each note perfectly timed yet unforced. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her body, her mind, and her spirit. The room was no longer just a hall of wealth and sophistication. It had transformed into a space where emotions were tangible, where every listener felt something personal and profound. The climax of the piece approached. The notes became bolder, more commanding, yet never losing their subtle beauty. The young waitress's eyes remained closed, her focus absolute. She felt every vibration of the keys, every echo of the sound, every reaction of the audience, though she did not need to see it to know they were captivated. Suddenly, the room was so still that it seemed as if the air itself had stopped. Guests forgot to breathe. The staff froze in place. Even the billionaire, whose life had been filled with control and power, could only watch, mesmerized. Her music had taken over completely. Then she struck the final chord, strong, pure, and unyielding. The note lingered in the air, vibrating softly, almost like a heartbeat, and then silence. Absolute silence. The effect was immediate and profound. No one moved. No one spoke. The sound of the piano had faded, but its impact remained, heavy and beautiful in the air. The silence was more powerful than any applause could ever be. The guests, for the first time that evening, were completely still, holding the moment in awe. After a long pause, the billionaire slowly stood, his hands clapping once, deliberate and slow. The sound broke the silence, and the room erupted in applause. But it was different this time. It was not polite clapping, not forced smiles. It was genuine, heartfelt, a release of the collective emotion the music had stirred. Some guests had tears in their eyes. Some were smiling quietly, almost overwhelmed. Some were whispering to each other in disbelief. The young waitress stayed seated for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. Her hands rested on the keys, still trembling slightly. She opened her eyes and looked at the room. Faces she had never expected to see so moved were filled with admiration and respect. She had done more than play the piano. She had touched hearts. The billionaire approached her slowly. There was no arrogance in his stance this time, no smirk, no sarcasm. Only respect and perhaps a hint of awe. I have never heard anything like that, he said, his voice low and deliberate. You didn't just play. You spoke. You made everyone here feel something real. Even me. She stood, hands folded in front of her, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. She had expected nerves, mistakes, embarrassment. Instead, she had discovered the full power of her own talent, and the room had recognized it. I play what I feel, she said softly. He nodded slowly, taking a step back. What you feel? It's extraordinary. Not many people can do what you just did. You silenced the room with one song, and yet you made us feel everything. Her chest swelled with emotion. Years of hidden talent, of dreams tucked away in corners of her heart, had finally found their voice. And that voice had been heard, loud and clear, by the people she never expected, and even by the man whose power and influence could usually overshadow everything. Guests began to approach her, offering congratulations, some in tears, others with smiles that could not be faked. But she remained humble, polite, and quiet. She had done what she came to do. She had played honestly, and that had been enough. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She continued her duties, but the weight of the earlier moment stayed with her. She knew she had changed, that something had shifted in the way the world saw her, and in the way she saw herself. Later, when she finally returned home, she found her mother awake, waiting. How did it go? Her mother asked, her voice soft but full of anticipation. The young woman smiled quietly, exhausted but exhilarated. It was more than I expected, she said. Everyone listened, even the billionaire. I played, and they felt it. Her mother reached for her hands, holding them tightly. I knew you had something special. You just needed a chance to show it. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about everything that had happened. The piano, the audience, the billionaire. All of it had brought her to a moment she would never forget. She realized that her life had shifted in ways she hadn't imagined. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician. She had a voice, a story, and a power that could move people. And in that quiet realization, she understood something more. Talent was not measured by fame, money, or recognition. It was measured by honesty, by courage, and by the willingness to share what was inside. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream again. Not just small dreams, not just hidden hopes, big dreams. Dreams that could carry her beyond the walls of the hotel, beyond the eyes of skeptical guests, beyond the world she had always known. And it all began with one song. One song that had silenced the room, that had touched hearts, and that had finally allowed her to see the full value of her own music. Her journey was only beginning, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop playing.